Okay, we are back, and today we are going to talk about Lone Wolf arms. Today, specifically, we're going to talk about the Timberwolf frame. Now, considering that Glocks are already pretty modular, what we're looking at today is a modular frame that feeds off of the Gen 3 and 4 ecosystem as far as Glock is concerned. Now, these particular frames are available in full-sized compact. In other words, you have a commander-sized Glock like the 45, or the compact, which is essentially Glock 19 size. All of this coming in for around $130 shipped at a site like Brownells or something. And the really interesting part about all this to me is that in an era where we're starting to reuse a lot of buzzwords that were used quite a bit a few years ago with terms like super modular and stuff like that, it's kind of interesting to see something that is more or less flying underneath the radar for quite a few folks. And as far as feature set, use case, and what this overall means to you, the end user, I found that this in and of itself is one of the few true definitions of that term super modular. So let's go ahead and get into what that means in the first place. Today's video is sponsored by the Sonoran Desert Institute. Have you ever thought about making a living in the firearms industry? If you enjoy gun repair, ballistics, learning about firearms, the Sonoran Desert Institute might just be a good fit for you. To find out more about SDI, visit sdi.edu. Use the link in the description down below, or call 480-999-4767 today. And now back to the video. Alright, so let's first get into feature set, because as far as not Glock frames, there's certainly a right way to go about it, and there's also certainly a wrong way to go about it too, and there's a lot of people that really just do not do it quite well. For instance, like the PSA dagger slides. Having to use non-Glock pins to push things out can actually irreparably damage the frame itself, so it's nice to see that the pins for this frame are in fact just regular Glock pins, and there's nothing crazy, extra, or fancy going on about it. The other part about this, and this seems to just be something that a lot of people are just refusing to do, is that the frame dimensions themselves made up perfectly well with any Glock holster. I've thrown on the 34 slide that I've got on board this thing right now. I've also used a dagger slide to see if the dimension changes between those two slides would affect holster fitment, and none of that has occurred. So it's nice to know that someone else is putting out a frame that'll actually go in a friggin' holster that I'd already bought for the thing. The dust cover for the full-sized, and the full-sized compact have 3 slots for accessory lights and things like that. 2 of them are 1913 sized, and the one in the center is a Glock sized one. Now, this may sound a little weird on its face, but that's only to make sure that whoever is trying to use whatever kind of light, regardless of configuration, cannot just fit that light on the dust cover, but can also position it exactly where it is that they want to as well, because as many of you know, there are larger and smaller lights, and this is kind of a nice touch. The only difference between the one I've got and, for instance, their compact slide, which is the only difference between these 3, is that the compact slide only has 2. One of them is a 1913 and the other one is a Glock size slot for lights and such. And for now, one of my very favorite things about this setup in general is that there's a little plastic sleeve that slots itself into the frame itself that allows you to convert between Gen 3 and Gen 4 slides. Now, as many of you know, there is a dimension difference between the Gen 3 and Gen 4 recoil springs, and trying to throw on a Gen 3 slide to a Gen 4 frame usually results in some sort of huge gap. Now, this sort of closes that gap with a very simple, really cheap, and frankly ingenious method by simply putting a sleeve in there. And with this simple addition or subtraction, now either one of these slides will work on this frame with no issues. Up underneath the trigger guard itself is a decent undercut underneath it without any huge things relieved from the trigger guard itself, so that this can accommodate the widest number of people that still want to get a good and high grip on the frame itself when they're actually doing the shooting part. And more or less, you'll notice this theme overall is that there's a bunch of little nice touches that are added into the frame as we go. The polymer chemical compound itself seems to be similar in construction, or at least hardness, to the Smith & Wesson M&P. Only reason why I know this is because I personally like to stipple Glock frames or polymer frames in general. So after I spent a couple hours on this frame with a wood burning kit, I noticed that unlike a Glock's frame, which when you're done with that wood burning kit has like this spongy, warm feeling to it, M&Ps have a tendency to feel a little bit like a bunch of broken glass underneath the hand. Now, I might be weird in this, but I personally like that feeling, and for the first couple thousand rounds, I kind kind of like the feeling of my handgun not wanting to let go of me, because at the very least I know that whatever stippling I just added to this is going to hang on for a really long time. So again, really nice touch. Now, something that a lot of the Glock cloners have refused to do, or are unable to do, is include a Gen 4 magazine release with their cloned frames of said guns. Now, I personally like that in this particular case, that isn't the case, and that this comes with a Gen 4 magazine release, because not only is this reversible for those that are into that, it's also functionally a little bit better too. Buttons a little bit larger, a little bit easier to get a hold of. And in this particular case also, if you get an assembled frame from Lone Wolf Arms, which I just recommend that you do, and I'll get back to that here in just a second, the magazine release itself is slightly extended, which I personally prefer. And if you don't like that, which both are perfectly functional, you can also put a standard one in there as well, because again, all the dimensions are the same. The only thing that was noticed between myself and a friend of mine that picked up one of these frames so that we had two different perspectives on testing is that when he tried to put in a metal magazine release into this frame, it would just straight up reject it because it wouldn't lock up magazines. Now, does that mean a whole lot to you? It doesn't to me, mostly because I just don't use metal magazine releases in my Glocks. I don't see the point in the first place. But he did have one lying around, and the thought virus just kind of jumped into his head to, hey, why don't we just take a look at this to see if it's compatible with it? And in this particular case, it's not. That said, though, with stock magazine releases and that sort of thing, I actually put a standard one in there, and it all runs just fine. So if it's a polymer magazine release, it's going to work good, at least in our experience. And while we're talking about individual controls, let's talk about the internals. Now, except for one caveat, and we'll come back to that here in just a second, it's all stock internals on the inside. So takedown lever, slide lock lever, all of those little individual widgets are all individual Glock parts, and that's really nice because there's nothing really crazy special to adhere to except for one thing, but this one thing is actually quite nice. Now, Lone Wolf Arms uses a proprietary trigger housing for this particular frame, and I believe that this is patent related because a Gen 3 patent is lifted, but I don't really know the status of any Gen 4 stuff with regards to trigger housings. Point is that the reason that you should get this thing assembled if you're to go look for one is that if you were to change out trigger components, that's fine, and this will accept Gen 3 or Gen 4 components. The only thing that you have to be aware of is that if this comes in a drop-in unit that has its own trigger pack, you have to take all of those individual components out of that trigger pack and put them into this one, because this one is proprietary to the frame. Now, obviously, this requires you to more or less get their frame assembled, but what it also allows you to do is change between Gen 3 or Gen 4 triggers without issues. So kind of a strange, non-standard part, but once you take a step back and look at it, this actually makes perfect sense, number one, and number two, it just allows you to go through Gen 3 and Gen 4 components. Now, me personally, I wouldn't mix and match different trigger packs and different generations together. I haven't tried that, and I don't think really you should either, but what both of us did notice is that if we had a Gen 3 trigger kit from somewhere, or a Gen 4 trigger kit from somewhere, if we kept all those components together, assembled them into the trigger pack, and then function test and then drop test, check the individual components, these would all pass. So, as a for instance, he has a Gen 3 Haley skimmer in his, and I have a Gen 4 Overwatch trigger in mine. All of these work 110%, and the only trigger that you've ever seen me use is the Overwatch that is a Gen 4 set of components. Now, the only reason why this is even a possibility as far as functionality is concerned is simply because there's not a ton of differences between the two different generations. But like I said, all we really have to do is make sure that we put all the stuff into the Lone Wolf trigger housing, and we're good to go. Now, let's talk about grip angle, because it's a thing that everyone likes to get wrapped around the axle on. Now, the grip angle on this guy is more reminiscent of a Beretta 92, a CZ75, a Browning High Power, something like that, rather than a standard Glock grip angle. Now, for those of you that don't like this and just want a Glock grip angle, I totally understand that, because mechanically speaking, a Glock grip angle is going to help you out with recoil control as far as static mechanics a little bit more. The straighter grip angle type that we're looking at here is less mechanically efficient as far as recoil control is concerned, but more efficient as far as pointing the pistol is concerned. Point is, though, is that if you understand principles of leverage and friction, that that sort of thing. The recoil control aspect is not a problem at all, and the advantage is that it helps out with the bones of the wrist just a little bit more as far as being able to naturally point a handgun at something. Now, is either one of these two things a big deal? No, but it's a nice touch, because I can control the recoil of a pistol, and it's nice to just be able to naturally point things a little bit easier, especially one-handed. In addition to this, we also have a magazine well that comes pre-attached once you order the thing and it arrives at your FFL or whatever. Now, the magazine well itself works great, and because it's a proprietary magazine well to the actual frame itself, I actually don't have what you see in a lot of magazine wells for a lot of Glocks where there's that front lip bendy thing going on. And as an aside, that's never really an issue anyway, but it's just nice to not have to deal with this. That said though, other magazine wells are clearly not going to work because it's proprietary to the frame. Now, for those of you that see the beveled magazine well that this is built into and figure I don't really need this magazine well, you're in luck, because the magazine well is removable. So whatever your profile or use case is for this particular pistol, you can cover both of those either with or without that magazine well, and each item on its own is perfectly functional, and I don't really see the need to replace that magazine well with something else. While we're on the small edition side quest here, we're also going to talk about the very minor beaver tail that was also added to this thing, allowing the frame itself to push your hand out of the way just a little bit so that we can avoid getting bit by the slide, especially if you got huge hands. I don't, so this doesn't bother me, but I can certainly see its inclusion being a benefit to those that do have that issue, or have at least had that issue in the past. That said, it's not overly large, so it allows you to continue to do whatever draw method that you had from your concealed or your duty holster, so the fact that it's there isn't going to hurt you any. And rounding this all out with slide lock levers, for some reason it takes any Gen 3 or 4 slide lock lever because they're identical, so whatever aftermarket one that you want to put in is great, and the one that it comes with is the factory extended slide lock lever that is included in what used to be the production Glock 34s as well. And honestly, my appraisal of the feature set is that it's quite nice. There's a lot of little touches in here that sort of refine the experience, and the simple fact that it's adaptable to different things that you want to do with it is pretty great, especially for those that are looking to put together a brand new build or whatever. So I count the entire feature set as a plus, honestly, because even if you didn't have a trigger to put in the thing, the one that ships with an assembled frame is good enough to get the job done quite well and for long term. Because yes, there was a trigger installed with this to start, and yes, I checked it for drop safe functionality and it passed right away. And while yes, a brand new trigger is going to be a little stiff, you could see based off of my previous experiences that it's one of those triggers that's going to start a little bit stiff and a little bit creaky, but after a little while it would smooth out and be a quite nice trigger. Only reason why I changed this trigger in the first place is to see if A, it could do it, because that's supposed to be part of the appeal, and 2, I like Overwatch triggers, they're pretty nice. All in all though, it's got a pretty solid feature set that I wouldn't be bashful to recommend to anybody, honestly. But now that we've listed all these features and went over each one of them individually, who is this frame really for in the first place? So who I believe this is really for, honestly, is that this is one of those hidden gems designed for that person that really understands the Gen 3, 4 Glock aftermarket universe. These guys, generally speaking, know their way around Glocks and generally understand how to properly put together a custom build, that are also completely fed up with the total pain in the ass that is Polymer 80 builds. This is one of those frames in which, yeah, you gotta deal with the FFL, but it's also one of those things that is significantly safer and more reliable than any Polymer 80 I've ever seen, personally. And yeah, I got it. There's gonna be 100 of you in the comments that say that I've put together 2 billion Polymer 80s that have 90 million rounds on them apiece. I gotcha. But fact is, you can tell a lot about what students try to show up with to class, and a lot of these guys have Polymer 80s and refuse to bring them. They just bring the factory Glock out because they know it will work and they know that that build is really questionable, regardless to how precisely they think that they've cut those holes. And frankly, as far as the Polymer 80 world is concerned, if these builds weren't sus to start, Glock would be out of business, so I'm not gonna listen to that for even 1 second. Point is, though, is that this is a perfect way to put together that custom build, and it's absolutely perfect, or the worst, depending on how you look at it, for those that have restless gun syndrome. Not to steal a term from Brass Facts or anything, but for those that have restless gun syndrome and want to constantly change up their guns depending on how they feel that week, this is a really good hosting platform for all of that. Because frankly, as far as usability and all that stuff is concerned, it's a general purpose chameleon. You can turn this into basically whatever you want once you decide on a frame that you actually like. And if you're one of those types that could see yourself picking up the full-size compact or compact frames. Now with just these 3 frames, you can build any Glock in existence without any trouble at all. But the thing is though, is that who this is also perfect for is that guy that's super duper broke, really wants to get into gun stuff, but also really does need to budget properly. It's a great way to get into the Glock game, really cheap and reliably at the same time, while also keeping the door open for upgrades later on, and let me explain what I mean about that. So by now, I think it's well established that as far as the PSA dagger is concerned, my trouble with this entire setup is their frames. I don't like their frames. I don't think their frames are constructed really well, but their slides more or less are just fine. I've seen the slides themselves running on different frames without any issue on quite a few occasions. So while we're talking about a company that can at least get half of a handgun right, all this really takes at this point is a little bit of a research project, and if you're trying to get into this as cheaply as possible while also having a handgun that will actually run and will actually be reliable while also allowing you the room to upgrade later on, we're looking at a frame that costs about $150 shipped, and then you can actually go to a dagger slide that's optic ready, although it isn't optic required at present, that has rear sights to the rear, and shipped we're looking at just around $300. This is a gun that comes in that is functional, reliable, and it's compatible with whatever it is that you want it to be compatible with, that you can further upgrade from later on. That comes in significantly cheaper than any brand new Glock pretty much anywhere at this point, because the whole thing comes in at about $450, which considering a brand new Glock in box is around $600 at this point, or in some cases a little bit more, and especially considering, you know, times are hard for some folks, that's a big deal. And of course, as time goes on and dude wants to get a dot or wants to get a completely new slide, the cool part is that this frame is right there to accept whatever new options he wants to put on the table. Now, if I were the kind of person that would recommend a particular frame for a brand new person, or if I were to suggest a frame for someone that's never bought one of their frames before, I would have to not recommend the one that I personally picked up. Not that there's anything wrong with the frame that I picked up, it's just I would rather not recommend a full-size frame out the gate to everybody, if that makes any sense. If you want the most adaptable frame between the 3, I would go with the full-size compact, because as far as the ability to carry the gun and then upgrade it later, a commander-size gun will just fit most folks a little bit better. Or if you wanted to lean on the concealed side of the house a little bit more, or if you just couldn't hide full-size guns as well, then obviously the compact is the place to start. Point is that it doesn't really matter where you start. What matters is the simple fact that there's a whole host of things that you could add or change out from this frame that's easily supported by the massive ecosystem of aftermarket parts and available stuff. All you have to do is get pretty good at research projects. But either way, either you're one of those guys that can't leave his guns alone but would like his guns to work all the time, or one of those guys that really wants to get into this as cheap as possible, is serious about it because you intend on shooting but you're also just trying to spend money in a smart way, this is a good place to go for really anybody. But that's the overall message of this, isn't it? So now we're down to the summary, final thoughts, and all that stuff. Look, as far as reliability is concerned, it's exactly what you would expect out of, honestly, any Glock product. Because as far as the round count for this, I actually went over the initial intended round count for this particular review, which, by the way, for those that don't know, the minimum is around 6,000 rounds. I actually went over that to about 8,000 on this, and as far as reliability is concerned, there was no problem at all, ever. It just did exactly what a Glock frame is supposed to do. Host a slide, deal with whatever nonsense you're putting it through while you're given a piece of cardboard the jazz hands, and that's all. The adaptability and the modularity and all that stuff, these are all just really good add-ons, and the fact that it comes in pretty cheap is really nice too. Fact is that with all the new stuff that's coming out as of late, and with all of the reuse of terms that were buzzwords quite some time ago, like super modularity and things like that, it's interesting to note that this is one of those products that's sort of flown underneath the radar with all the RXMs of the world. And yes, that testing process is still ongoing. You'll get your review on it. What's interesting to note, though, is that Lone Wolf has been doing the aftermarket Glock part stuff a lot longer than most people realize, because a lot of you may be hearing about Lone Wolf for the first time today. Now, I don't particularly know why this is, but for those of you that have been at this for over a decade and a half, this is a name that a lot of people have just heard about and never thought much of, other than their original logo, which was horrendous. But the new one's fine. That said, though, and anytime I've ever seen anyone else with Lone Wolf parts or barrels or whatever, I never really cared much, simply because I knew that thing is going to work. It's going to work well. It's going to just do its job. It's just a little fancier, or in much older cases, gaudier, than stock Glock stuff. You just knew it was going to work either way, and this is yet another one of the products that they make that does exactly that. It does exactly the job that it's supposed to. It's boring in that regard, but it also allows you a little more flexibility, which for an already modular platform, the fact that you can add even more modularity to it is nothing but a plus, and especially if it doesn't cost all that much. So as far as quality, they're good to go, and as far as pricing, they're good to go too, because I've been perusing their website for other stuff that they make, like complete slides, or in some cases complete guns, and you know what? I'm probably gonna put more of their stuff in my reviews in the future, because there's some things that genuinely catch my eye. But that said, this review is just to remind folks that Lone Wolf still exists, and they got way better than they used to before, not just with their horrific logo choices, because the new one's actually pretty good, but because their products are still good to go too. So if you never heard about them until today, or if you heard about them in passing and didn't think anything of them, I would take another swing at their stuff and at least look at their site, because me personally, I'm quite intrigued by a lot of the stuff that they have on offer, especially with all the talk of other stuff that's unproven that's floating about the world at present. So with that said, guys, if you want to come out and train with us, you absolutely can. We have open enrollment classes scheduled all the way out to December, with places like Fitzpatrick, Alabama, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and a bunch of other places that are on the open enrollment schedule currently, which includes places like Mississippi, for places like a soft skin vehicle class, and a night vision class, and a whole bunch of other stuff. If you'd like to support us through Patreon, you can absolutely do that too, and if you want to get something out of it, $41 a month gets you as much open enrollment training as you would like throughout the year, with only a couple exceptions made, one being for private classes for pretty obvious reasons, and the other being for logistically challenging classes like a soft skin vehicle class for fairly obvious reasons. If you want to check us out through the rest of our little social media links, you can absolutely do that too. Links for all of this are in the description below, to include the new Discord that I opened up recently, and remember, a regular guy's firearm is the last defense against tyranny. Be easy.